Good afternoon. My name is Tom Buecker, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, which are held in room 303 on the third floor of the City County Building on the third Thursday of each month. A detailed schedule of this series, as well as information about Historical Society activities and programs, can be found at our website, www.nebraskahistory.org. I'd like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding for the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television and on our YouTube website. Today, I will be the program, and I'm going to present a paper that I prepared for a Fort Robinson conference several years ago. And we'll be talking about enclosed forts. Now, there's a couple things that I'll sort of bring up beforehand in this. When we're talking about the department or the Department of the Platte, the Army had the United States divided into departments, and they were just a geographical area for where they had it for administrative purposes and also for command purposes. Now, Nebraska falls in what we call the Department of the Platte, and essentially the Department of the Platte is Nebraska and Wyoming, and then also varying parts of Utah. They kind of changed their borders, but generally that would be Nebraska and Wyoming. Number two, we'll be talking about how the effect of how these forts were built in several periods, or in one main period of conflict between the native tribes, or Plains Indians, and the Army and the whites and whatever. Essentially, this begins with the Minnesota Uprising in 1862. Now, this was dealing with the Santee and basically southern part of Minnesota. And it was a very bloody conflict. It was one of the bloodiest that existed during history. So this was 1862, so the Minnesota, we call the Minnesota Uprising, is in 1862, and then we get to the 1864 war, in 1864 and 1865, and this basically is an increase of troubles. And we must remember, too, that the United States Army at the time of the Civil War was very small, and maybe about 10,000 men. But all of the regular troops are being sent back to the east to fight the Confederacy. And so they had state units organized that are fighting in the West. So all of the regular army is fighting in the Eastern Theater. And then after that, we talk about the Bozeman Trail and the Bozeman War. This begins in 1866. And this was because a wagon route was made to get up into Montana, up into the mining areas up in there, laid out by a guy named John Bozeman. And of course, the Lakotas did not like this idea of just cutting basically from Douglas, Wyoming, along the frontage of the Bighorn Mountains, taking a hard left turn and going into Bozeman, into that part of western Montana. And essentially, the Bozeman War lasted from 1866 until 1868. So those are the three major periods of conflict that you'll be kind of talking about and how they related to Army fortifications. Okay. Remember those great Western forts we all saw in the movies? You know, the ones with big log walls and blockhouses and huge gates through which rode the likes of General George Custer, Randolph Scott, right there, and John Wayne rode out of. Strong, secure, palisaded structures that safely protected their garrisons from attack by warring tribesmen. They were, in fact, the fort in the West, what the fort in the West should look like. We know this. I remember my disappointment upon finding out that the Fort Lincoln that General Custer actually rode out of did not have walls or a gate for that matter. Similarly, a question asked by more than one alert tourist after visiting the museum at Fort Robinson was, okay, where's the fort at? But in reality, Hollywood-type forts were built, regardless of what many of us would be led to believe. This map shows the 64 Northern Plains Army posts built between 1819 and 1886 in Nebraska, Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming. All of the posts were occupied for a minimum of 2 years and were specifically built for military purposes. The forts are camped, underlined in red, are those that I considered enclosed forts. Closed in by log or heavy board walls or adjoining buildings, or a combination of both. As a result, 22 posts, 1/3 of those built on the northern plains were of the enclosed types. Now, when I started in this business and researching and interpreting about military history and stuff, we were generally told, and we related the fact that Army posts out in the West were not enclosed. Because, number one, you don't have materials. Number two, it's a lot of work. But there were quite a number, and as you can see the ones in red, that's about like 1/3 of the posts out in this country were enclosed at one time. 5 different enclosed fort types can be identified. Our first example is the building enclosed type, where the back walls of contiguous buildings form the defensive wall of the enclosure. The first United States military posts west of the Mississippi River was of this type. Cantonment, Missouri, which you see here, built in 1819, and also which was replaced by Fort Atkinson in 1820. Now, both of those early forts were enclosed, and you can see there's a diagram here, and that shows how the backs of the buildings formed the defensive wall. It's an enclosed fort. At that time, Fort Atkinson was the largest army post in the United States, with each side of the fort enclosure over 200 yards long and a capacity of 1,000 soldiers plus dependents. Of course, we must bear in mind at this time, the United States Army, at the time Fort Atkinson was in existence, was a total of 6,000 men. So you had 1/6 of them at one army post. Fort Sully, number 1, built in central South Dakota in 1864, was another example of a building enclosed fort. As shown in this excellent drawing, the back walls of the buildings were the outside wall of the enclosed area. Fort Mitchell, Nebraska, is out by Scotts Bluff, was a small one-company post also built in 1864. Was building enclosed on 3 sides with the stockade protected corral adjoining on the east. In the background, you can see this is William Henry Jackson's painting on the left is Scotts Bluff, the monument, and then Mitchell Pass right there in the center, and the Platte River off to the left. The palisade enclosed fort was the traditional enclosed type created when a defensive wall of logs was set in a trench or sawed boards fastened to a framework completely surrounding the buildings. The classic example of a palisade fort in the West was Fort Phil Kearny, built in 1866. It was the largest fully enclosed fort built on the northern plains. And this was one of the Bozeman Trail forts built that year. And this would be between Buffalo, basically between Buffalo and Sheridan, Wyoming, is where this was located. This drawing by Colonel Henry Carrington, who engineered the fort, shows the detail of the construction, including height, depth of ditch, firing platform, and loopholes for rifle fire. Another enclosed fort was Fort Reno. Fort Reno would be the first Bozeman Trail fort, and then the middle fort was Fort Phil Kearny, and then in Montana, the northern fort was what was named Fort C.F. Smith. Notice the palisade walls are a separate construction feature surrounding the buildings. This was also apparent in the plan of Fort Ellis, built in 1867 in Montana Territory. You see the wall going around of blockhouses in the corners. Although Fort Buford began as a full palisaded enclosed one-company post in 1866, it was expanded to a 5-company post the next year. The rebuilt post had a palisaded wall on 3 sides, but was left open and not stockaded on the south side facing the Missouri River. Fort Thompson, built to guard the Crow Creek Agency in South Dakota, was surrounded by a 300 by 400 foot cottonwood stockade. Combination enclosed types were the most common example of enclosed fort on the northern plains. This type was formed by the back walls of separate buildings with palisades used to fill in the voids in between. An excellent example of this type was Fort C.F. Smith, 1866 to 1868, with log walls set between adobe buildings. Fort Rice, and this is in North Dakota, right on the Missouri River, just north into the state from South Dakota, present-day South Dakota, is another example. In the plan shown here, sections of palisade fill in between the buildings. This early sketch of the first Fort Totten in North Dakota and one of Fort Cottonwood, later become Fort McPherson, Nebraska, both illustrate the combination construction. See, we have both types, but you've still got an enclosed fort where it's not open. It all has this fortification protecting it. There were 2 structural adjuncts that were necessary to effectively defend any enclosed perimeter: bastions and blockhouses. A bastion was simply a projection from the enclosing wall which enabled defenders to deliver inflating fire along the walls with rifle or artillery fire. As shown on the plan for Fort Atkinson, one bastion could sweep 2 stretches of the wall with cannon fire. You see the way the cannon, this is protecting this wall, and this is protecting this wall. This drawing of Camp Cook in Montana pictures a bastion which could protect the more openly exposed perimeter, part of the perimeter. You notice this is the corner there facing the plains. On the other hand, a blockhouse was a small fortified building used as a flanking device in enclosed forts. Blockhouse design and purpose was little changed from the earliest forts built on the American frontier. The first military blockhouse, this is kind of interesting here. The first military blockhouse built on the northern plains was at the site of the first Fort Kearny, built in eastern Nebraska in 1846. And this is Nebraska City today. This sketch shows the blockhouse in 1849, and then this is after they actually moved the post further west where it's at Kearny, Nebraska today. Three Army posts began as enclosed civilian fur trade posts, purchased by the government for military use. Unfortunately, by that time, they were generally wore out and unfit for any habitation or long-term use. The first example was Fort Laramie, purchased in 1849. That's kind of an interesting illustration there where the light's shining down on good old Laramie. Fort Benton, this is in Montana on the Missouri River. Fort Benton, which became an Army post in 1869, was too small, leading the post surgeon to remark, quote, "Its capacity is sufficient for one superintendent and about 20 employees under the fur trade, but not for a company of soldiers." Now, a company is going to be about twice or 3 times that number. And you can see that everything is enclosed, close quarters. From 1864 until 1867, Fort Berthold in North Dakota, and this was along the Missouri River also, was rented from the Northwest Fur Company. However, this is interesting, however, due to a dispute with their agent, the government evidently never owned or paid rent for its use. And the first thing about that happened was after the soldiers took over and started using those buildings for their barracks, the first thing that happened was they built new barracks buildings outside of the enclosure. So, but if they did get in trouble under attack, they did have a place that they could get to. Two other types of enclosed forts are a little more down to earth. During the Civil War years, defensive works were largely earthen fortifications. In the Eastern Theater, earthwork forts proved to be the state of the art, to survive heavy bombardment or assault. Although most assuredly Plains Indian tribesmen lacked any form of artillery support, several earthwork fortifications did appear on the northern plains. This is probably due to an abundance of dirt and men with shovels. Employed to a lesser degree, earthwork enclosed fort types were created when buildings were simply enclosed by an earthwork and a ditch. Several examples in classic form were located on the northern plains. Fort Wadsworth, later Fort Sisseton, this is in northeastern South Dakota, built in 1864, was protected by an earth breastwork surrounded by a ditch. Here, as in the east, the process of resodding the embankments was a continual process to prevent erosion. So this is another way how you keep your men occupied. See, a duty was rebuilding the earthworks and resodding. In southeastern North Dakota, only the earthwork, ditch, and several cellar depressions remain of Fort Ransom, built in 1867. And you can see in this picture, this is a modern picture. It's kind of a state-operated area, and you can see the lighter area there is where the maintenance guys mowed the grass. When you notice the darker areas, that's the ditch, and they didn't, and the berm, the wall, they didn't mow that, so that's why it appears in different coloration there. Another benefit of earthwork fortifications was that defensive works could easily be added to existing forts if there was available workforce. This was the case at two large trail forts in 1864 and 65. One was Fort Laramie, where after the Mud Springs fight in February 1866, 3 battery emplacements connected by a defensive trench were dug to protect the northeast approach to the fort. You can see there's where the artillery would be on that point there, this point here, and over in here someplace. And then in 1866, an adobe redoubt, right here, was built next to the Laramie River to anchor the line. Fort Kearney, located in extremely flat open country, had fortifications dug during the 1864-65 Indian War. While the 2 smaller works were built to protect the northwest and also the corral in the northeast, you see them marked in yellow, East Fort was constructed with a connecting trench to protect the southern approach to the fort. These fortifications were never used, as Fort Kearney was never attacked. As a later example, earthworks also appeared at the first site of Fort Sheridan, built in 1874, near the Spotted Tail Agency. A long trench was dug to protect the south side of the camp, while revetments were placed in the corners of the bluff overlooking the agency. So this trench right here. And then the main area here was where the soldiers were temporary. They were living in tents, so they were up in this area. And here's a revetment here, and there's one here, and you can see one there. So they had more fortified points which were, when you go out at this site, that trench is still this deep. I mean, it's just plain as day. The men were building this they went there to this location in early March. And they were on top of this bluff, and they got about 4,000 or 5,000 Brulés, Dominicanjus, and other associated Lakotas around there. And they weren't too sure how they were going to get along with their neighbors, so they thought we need to have some sort of a defensive measure. So there were 4 infantry companies there, and each infantry company was assigned to dig a section of the trench. And so every day these men are out there, digging this trench. And about the time they got it done, they decided, well, this is not a good location, let's move someplace else. So they left, and the trenches are still there to this day. Sod-enclosed forts occurred at several locations on the northern plains. The first was Fort Gratton, a small defensive fort work built in 1855 by the Harney expedition at the mouth of Ash Hollow. And Ash Hollow is that point on the Oregon Trail where the trail drops down into the North Platte Valley. Well, they decided that maybe we'll station a small number of troops here. It's on the trail. The closest Army fort they had was Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie, nothing in between. So they built this defensive work, constructed wholly of sods. Its walls were 3 foot thick and 6 foot high. The fortification was barely completed before it was abandoned. And it was an interesting thing when you look at maps that were drawn of Nebraska in the 1850s and 60s, they always show Fort Gratton on there because that's one location they knew where it was. Although there was nobody there, it still appears on these maps all the way up into the 1870s. The second site was at Camp Rankin, later renamed Fort Sedgwick. Although it was in Colorado, at Julesburg, Colorado, Sedgwick was considered by the Army to be in the Department of the Platte. So see, it was one of these forts that was, well, it's close enough. It was really close to Nebraska, so yeah, it's a Department of the Platte post. The post was established in 1864. See, here we're going back to that period of hostility in 1864 to 1865 period. It was built by the 7th Iowa Cavalry. See, it was one of these state regiments that were out in the west because where are the regulars at? Back in the east. The large stockade or sod stockade they built was 240 by 360 feet in size with walls 8 foot high. When the troops arrived, and see, this was always the thing that back in this time, when you would need a post, you need a fort, when you're going to station troops someplace, who gets the job? Do we have contractors out there? Do we hire civilians out there to build these Army posts? No. Why not? 2 reasons: the Army was too cheap, and another reason was there wasn't a whole lot of available labor force. So your troops are the ones who are building these forts back in this early time period. When the troops arrived, they were ordered by telegram to make a fortification prepared to hold the place at any odds. And Fort Sedgwick, very shortly after it was built, came under real heavy attack in January and early in 1865, and they came, instead of holding the place, they came pretty close to losing it a couple times. Naturally, the main reason that forts were enclosed was for protection. Early settlers in New England built stockades and blockhouses for defense. As settlement moved west, the common knowledge was stockades were necessary to survive Indian attacks. At Fort Sully No. 2, an inspecting officer reassured that, quote, the post has a stockade and blockhouses of the most substantial construction. In hostile settings, the building of a palisade was a high priority. A soldier resident once boasted that Fort Sully was pretty well fixed for defense. It cannot be taken very easily by the Indians. Of course, he really didn't know because they never attacked the place. See, we're building these fortifications, and very, very seldom did they come under attack. But it must be remembered that Western tribesmen were not prepared to besiege a fortified place. Now, the one example of a real one of these Western movie attacks was at Fort was at Fort Ridgely in the Minnesota Uprising of 1862, when the post was actually assaulted and the men were inside the buildings. But you know what? It was an open post. You know, it didn't have an enclosure, but it did come under attack. The far majority of the Northern Plains enclosed posts were built between 1863 and 67. This time span corresponded with a period of intense warfare which began with the 1862 Minnesota Uprising, then the Indian War of 1864-65, and the Bozeman Trail War. In the 5 years that followed the 1862 attack on Fort Ridgely, pictured here, the Army built 26 planes on the Northern Plains. 18 or 70% of the number they built at that time, 70% were enclosed forts. A stockaded fort provided its inhabitants with an overall sense of security. While stockades could not be penetrated by any weaponry commonly used by the Indians, a fort's artillery could reach out at any attacking force well out of rifle range, rifle fire. Stockades also provided a protective obstruction which an attacking force could not charge through. Such a defensive measure would have been valuable at Fort Laramie in the summer of 1864, when Lakota raiders rode through the fort and ran off horses right on the post parade ground. Where stockades were built to hold cavalry and quartermaster animals, losses to post livestock were prevented. The corral enclosure at Fort Reno was one of the first defensive features completed at the post. At Fort Phil Kearny, remember this was the largest enclosed fort that appeared in the West. Shown here, a massive quartermaster enclosure joined on the south side of the main post. Built in the shape of a trapezoid, 525 by 675 feet in size, the quartermaster stockade protected the mule stables, civilian employee stables, and shops. At Fort Buford, and this was the post up in North Dakota on the Missouri River, the quartermaster and cavalry areas were integrated into the main post stockade. See, like right here, all these little buildings right here, well, these are quartermaster employees. And see, they're living right out in the corral with the animals, see? Strong defenses were necessary at smaller temporary military stations which housed fewer numbers of defenders. Troops were frequently needed to protect stage stations along the overland route through Nebraska and Wyoming, particularly during the 1864-65 Indian War. At that time, Fort McPherson provided guards to stations up to 100 miles west of the post. Other military outposts were established at stations west and east of Fort Kearny. Along the Platte River Trail, sod walls also protected post buildings and stuff. This is a picture, this was the stage station, Labonte Station, about in the vicinity of where Douglas, Wyoming is. And you would have a number, maybe 20 soldiers, maybe a company size. So you have a lot less men. Well, then they were really, really interested in building fortifications. So the less manpower you have, you like to have, you know, this sense of security by having a fortification. And they were located up, and this was built up in Wyoming. So there was a good supply of nearby wood, you know, so they could build these structures. Plum Creek Station, shown here, was established as a subpost of Fort McPherson. And it had sod walls, 100 yards long with two corner bastions. The stockade at O'Fallon's Bluff, and this was right west of North Platte, was extended to perform effective defense and, quote, could be held against any force of hostile Indians. Of course, they really didn't know if it could be held or not because it never came under attack once again. At the same point, it was recorded that the stockade around the corrals and sod buildings at Beauvois Station afforded ample protection. Defensive measures were planned but not built at several major western forts. War Department economics were the main reason not. Construction of walls at large posts could prove an expensive proposition. For example, the Army plan for Fort Laramie called for a stout, board fence or rubble wall with blockhouses in the diagonal corner. You can see the wall there is marked in red. The defensive measures were rejected. Likewise, the original plan for Fort Kearny, Nebraska, was to enclose an area of 4 acres. But due to the expense of hauling lumber, the fact that neighboring Indians were never a threat, the wall was not built. At Fort Stevenson, and this is in kind of north-central North Dakota, again, a river fort on the Missouri River, and it was constructed to replace the ill-fated Fort Buford. Remember the place that they never paid rent for? Well, this was replaced it. The Sally Port entrance to the fort was built, but no other defensive works. So see, this is what we call the Sally Port right here. And it would have been the gate where you would have gone inside the enclosure. But look, they built the entrance, but they didn't have any walls. So they didn't follow through with that plan. Where's this, John?
Fort Sidney.
Yeah. Experience eventually proved that in many areas, fort defensive measures were not necessary. Building fortifications were never part of the equation at places in open areas free from sudden attack. Army posts near populated areas and railroads, like Sidney Barracks or Fort Fred Steele, did not need to be fortified. Larger forts erected out of harm's way were built as open posts and remained that way. Omaha Barracks and Fort D.A. Russell. Omaha Barracks, of course, in Omaha. Fort D.A. Russell is at Cheyenne, Wyoming. They were the two largest forts built in the post-Civil War West, never were enclosed. Because there were no walls or fortifications at open forts, travelers passing by were frequently confused and disillusioned. They were seeing what they didn't, they were coming from the east. If you see this large fortification like Fort McHenry in the east, when you get out west, what are you going to see? You're going to see cannons and stone walls. What do they see? Like that. This was particularly the case at Fort Kearny when one early visitor commented, quote, "I had never seen a fort before and confess I had a good deal of curiosity to see this one. I was greatly disappointed with its appearance." So they weren't seeing forts. And Fort Kearny, it's interesting, was actually mistaken by some passerbys and noted in their diaries as a trading post. Although the Plains Indians were generally reluctant to attack fortified positions, they waged war on the white soldiers. In September 1862, Sisseton and Yankton Sioux attacked Fort Abercrombie in North Dakota, then an open post, and threatened the fort. Coming just weeks after the assault on Fort Ridgely, the post was in, quote, in imminent peril for many days, having no stockade. By February 1863, a stockade and blockhouses were completed, making the post, quote again, defensible against almost any number of Indians. And after that first major demonstration, they just never came back and bothered them anymore. After the upper Missouri forts were established in the mid-1860s, they came under fire. This was particularly true at Fort Buford. And this is the earlier Fort Buford before it was expanded like we saw in the picture, where frequent hostile demonstrations were made just outside the garrison. On those occasions, artillery fire from the fort effectively drove off the harassing warriors. Fort Sedgwick became a point of refuge when nearby Julesburg come under heavy assault several times in 1865. And the state of war that existed along the Bozeman Trail is well documented in the history of the Wyoming and the West. Even with defensive works, inhabitants were frequently in fear of attack. For several days after the Federman disaster, this was the Federman Fight in December of 1866, the constant drifting of snowstorms made it possible for men to walk over the stockade at Phil Kearny. Did you remember how tall the stockade from that diagram was? It was 8 foot. See, so this is possible. See, that this could happen. As a preventive measure, the beleaguered soldiers continued continually shoveled snow to clear it 10 feet away from the palisade. Luckily, they're not in Buffalo, New York, right? During the emergency, the troops received artillery training, and each man had his designated loophole or position. Up the trail at Fort C.F. Smith, remember this was the building, the combination enclosed with buildings and palisade in between. Mrs. Captain Burt feared that the attacking warriors could climb over the log walls and be inside the enclosure. She was also leery about how the windows of her quarters opened through the outside walls of the enclosure. See here? Another fear for Mrs. Burt was that fire once started along the log palisades between the buildings, and she was worried that it could sweep through the fort like a flash. A somewhat change of venue came at Fort Sedgwick during the attack in February 1865. Although the walls and the buildings of the fort were made of sod and fireproof, 2 officers chose to observe the fight from the highest point of enclosure. That happened to be the post haystack. As a precaution, they had 2 enlisted men detailed with kettles of water in case fire arrows from the attackers ignited their observation point. Although many considered stockades to be an essential component for Western forts, there were distinct disadvantages to their construction. First, there's a general lack of timber in the northern plains. Secondly, stockades were labor-intensive to build. Thousands of trees had to be cut and formed into logs, and long stretches of ditch dug. You saw the diagram of Phil Kearney? The ditch they were digging is 3 foot deep. We don't have backhoes. At Fort Phil Kearney, it was determined to complete the stockade before work on other buildings could begin. Accordingly, if some of the thousands of man-hours involved in building the stockade might have been applied on training, this could have formed a basis for a truly effective defense. Stockade construction depended upon the skills of the builders. The first wall around Fort Reno, it's Fort Reno pictured here, was carelessly constructed of cottonwood lumber. Just after completion, it had to be dismantled and the logs cut to even lengths, realigned and reset. And there's Fort Reno again. Other stockades' disadvantages were noted at Fort Reno. During the Indian alarms, let's see what happens. These guys, a bunch of them get on horseback and they're riding around on the hills outside of the post. See, just demonstrations. So many men used the building roofs, stockade walls, and bastions for grandstands to watch the action. The sentries were issued orders to fire upon anyone doing so. Additionally, the post surgeon complained that the soldiers were in the habit of urinating against the stockades at all calls of nature, instead of going to the latrines where they're supposed to go. Some officers in the late 1860s and 70s were skeptical of the real value of stockades. General Philip D. Trobian, on the left, commander of the District of Dakota, thought it was far better for troop morale to depend upon vigilance and breech loaders than hide behind palisades. He felt the log walls around Fort Totten gave the place a disagreeable air of a prison. After inspecting Fort Phil Kearney, Major General William B. Hazen, on the right, criticized the building of a stockade for such a large garrison. Medical officers were critical of the poor air circulation inside palisaded walls. The post surgeon at Fort Totten was pleased the new fort had no heavy stockade, as he said, which tend to obstruct ventilation and demoralize troops. At the same point, the Fort Rice, this is Fort Rice right here, surgeon complained the space between the buildings at the rebuilt fort was too close to admit adequate daylight. And you can see this. They like to have these barracks be like 60 foot apart. They're about 8 foot. Others believed stockades were detrimental to troop morale. The troops on the upper Missouri had to face the fact that life beyond the post walls was dangerous. Consequently, the soldiers frequently seemed content to wait out emergencies, rather than to ride out in harm's way. When they did go out in pursuit, they faced the frustration of chasing an enemy that could not be caught. By the early 1870s, the realization finally set in that walls might not be necessary, that stockades began to disappear. The turning point could be considered 1872, and this was the year the last permanent army post with fortifications was built. It was Fort McKean, later to become part of Abraham Lincoln at Bismarck, North Dakota, where 3 blockhouses, you can see the 3 blockhouses, connected with palisades to protect the post. However, at other posts, they were on the way out. The Fort Buford stockade was removed early in 1871, and the stockade at Fort Ellis and the earthwork protecting Fort Wadsworth or Sisseton was leveled in 1875. Additionally, the deteriorated condition of palisaded works warranted their removal. This was particularly true in construction with cottonwood logs, which rotted off at the bottom. In 1880, part of the rotted stockade at Fort Sully was blown down in a storm. Instead of rebuilding a palisade, it was simply removed. Along these lines, the stockade around the Cheyenne River post gradually disappeared, washed away by the encroaching Missouri River. The new replacement fort had neither stockade or blockhouses. You can see here was the original edge of the river, and then a couple months later, this is gone, and finally it got to, that's when they said, well, let's go to Highland. Stockades disappeared at other locations when fort complexes were rebuilt. Such was the case at Fort Sedgwick, shown here, rebuilt in an open post. The same was true at Fort McPherson and Fort Abercrombie. An exception to the rule was Fort Rice, where a palisade of 2-inch planks with 2 sally ports and 2 blockhouses was built in 1868. Fort Rice remained enclosed until it was abandoned as a military post in 1878. You can see the board stockade and the blockhouse right there. When enclosed forts were abandoned, the buildings and palisades were dismantled for salvage, used for fuel, or as in the case of the Bozeman Trail posts, burned down by the celebrating Northern warriors. And this is a representation of the burning of Fort Phil Kearny, and after the Army left in 1868. Sometimes blockhouses remained after the enclosing walls were removed. While some were retained as defensive works, the majority were reused for other purposes. Blockhouses became guardhouses, storehouses, and even one a magazine. The blockhouse at Fort Sanders, and this is at Laramie, Wyoming, pictured here, served for a time as an officer's quarters. Even though war on the northern plains was not over, the days of the enclosed forts were. Although several temporary enclosed outposts did appear, such as Red Canyon, Dakota in 1876, the paranoia resulting from the Minnesota Uprising and the 1860s wars had ended. After the end of the Great Sioux War, a new generation of large army posts, all of open design, were built to hold the reservation Indians in check. Over the years, much has been done to commemorate the enclosed forts of the northern plains. During the Depression year, North Dakota rebuilt blockhouses and palisades at the sites of Fort Abercrombie, Lincoln, and Rice. In other projects, the earthworks surrounding Fort Sisseton, South Dakota, have been reconstructed. And likewise, portions of Fort Phil Kearny stockade were rebuilt to help interpret the post. Perhaps the most impressive reconstruction effort of an enclosed fort is at Fort Atkinson State Historical Park in Nebraska. Here, three complete sides of what was once the largest military post in the United States have been reconstructed. And you can see here where they've lost, this is where now, after the Army left, where the bluff had disappeared due to the river, which used to flow right here. see, that would have been where the third side would have, or the fourth side would have been right like that. Well, this is the end of another fort story. And in conclusion, we can say that maybe Hollywood was at least partially correct in its depiction of the Western forts. Thank you. Anybody have a question? Not you, John.
Fort Hotchkiss up by Ord.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have that in there?
I did not have Fort Hartsuff there because it was not enclosed.
Okay.
They were, Fort Hartsuff was really interesting because they had the Loop River and they had all that nice gravel there. And people were suffering in that vicinity so much from the grasshoppers about the time they were going to build a fort that they dumped a whole bunch of money into that place. And they had people coming in and working. And all their buildings were built out of grout, out of concrete. When they built, and the same year they did that, they built Camp Robinson, which became, of course, Fort Robinson. They spent $15,000 at Fort Robinson. And at Fort Hartsuff, they probably spent about 8 times as much. But the idea was also, it was a relief where people that needed it were provided for work, see. But there was no fortifications there. I remember the first time that, like I said, when I saw Fort Abraham Lincoln, you know, we were watching TV and you're watching all these movies and stuff, and you know, Rin Tin Tin, remember that? Fort Apache, you know, all that, yeah. Well, that's what it's going to look like. Well, you get up there and you find out, no, they were almost, the rest of the posts they took down the walls, they became open posts. They were an army fort, but no fortifications. But it is pretty interesting to me there, if you go to where this Camp Sheridan was, there are the fortifications, the earthwork fortifications there are visible, and most of the earthworks at Fort Kearney, down at Kearney, Nebraska, those are there today yet too. And you can tell where the fortifications at Fort Laramie, where their earthworks were dug. You can still see that stuff today. John?
Were the forts at the out west and southwest, were some of them enclosed? Or
They were, there was a lot of them, particularly, you know, like in the southwest, they had, of course, they were using adobe. And they had a lot of those large fortifications that were enclosed with adobe walls and stuff like that.
Fort Apache wasn't made with adobe.
No, it wasn't made out of rock. The real Fort Apache, no. But in the movie, yeah, that, or John Wayne movies, always writing out of the fort, you know, always did that stuff in the movies. Well, maybe not. But it's interesting that the surgeons just hated the stockades because you don't have an airflow. And if you've got a building, you got a barracks building, you got like 80 guys living in there, you want that breeze to blow through real nice, you know. And that, as time goes on, they wanted to do things like the Surgeon General came up with this, that every barrack needs to have 500 cubic feet per man living in that building. And some of these places, when you looked at them and you counted out the number of men and the measurements of the building, like 300, and some of them 250. So it was, they were improving, and when they got to the 1880s, then they're building very nice modern forts that were permanently constructed that are really far superior than what Fort David A. Russell was built in 1867 at Cheyenne, Wyoming, to protect the Union Pacific Railroad. What's it called today? Today it's Francis E. Warren Air Force Base. And you get very tired of driving through Fort Warren and seeing these very nice brick barracks and brick stables. There's 20 brick stables in a row that's standing today, and it's an Air Force base. And they've reused the old structures. It's really, really neat. And the same way about, well, you've heard of Offutt Air Force Base, right? That was the last fort built in Nebraska. This Fort Crook, built in 1890, started in 1891. So here you have, like, the last Army fort built in Nebraska was more than likely the most powerful military installation in the United States. And it's really kind of funny there where you get high-ranking officers are fighting to live on post in the old quarters that were company-grade officer quarters, like built for lieutenants and captains. And I was given a tour off at one time. We were walking around a parade ground, and I said, "Oh, this building right here, now this was built for the commanding officer of an Army fort that today is a Air Force base, and right now it's occupied by a Rear Admiral because of Stratcom." Anything else?
The forts don't seem to follow any particular pattern like a government would have. Certain, who made the decisions?
Well, you know, this goes according to how long is it going to be there, what kind of materials do we have available, and most of them were established to serve a need. See, a lot of these things were camps, like Camp Robinson, Camp Sheridan. They're built to serve an emergency. A fort is a permanent place. That's why in 1878 they redesignated Camp Robinson as Fort Robinson, because it's a permanent installation. And so a lot of them, after the need was over, you know, they had all of these Army posts kind of to protect against, to guard the agencies. When the agencies are moved to the reservation, you know, we don't need the Army there. Then you got to remember, how big was the Army? How big was the Army? How big do you think it was? Between 1870 and the Spanish-American War, the United States Army was 25,000 men, and that's counting every instructor at West Point. Everything, the whole Army, 25,000 men. See, so not very much there. And another thing is, up until 1877, 1/3 of that number is on reconstruction duty in the South. So we ended up, you know, by 1880, there was one soldier for every 110 square miles of the Department of the Platte. So they were just able to get the people around where they needed them, you know, when they needed them. You know, so it's kind of an interesting deal when you look at the logistics. That's what people avoid.
It's interesting to look at the census and see the amount of Indians that were being used as part of the military.
Oh yeah, I mean, they had Indian scouts. They had the Indians in the 1870s during the Sioux War that signed up as scouts. When the Army came out with pensions, the Army didn't have pensions for Indian War veterans until the 1920s. See, and those Lakotas and Oglalas and Brulés that were serving the scouts, they got pensions too. That's why you go up in the res and you go see a lot of these, in a lot of their cemeteries, you'll see they're marked with a standard government stone, has their name, and down below it says U.S. Scout. You see? So another thing is, like, if you have one particular group of people that didn't like the others, like the Pawnee Scouts, well, Pawnee Scouts in the Sioux, that doesn't work. And so then they were organized by the North Brothers, who very effectively served during the 1860s and 1870s. So it's really, this whole business about the Army back then is just really, really, you know, interesting, you know, about what's going on. And another thing you take in consideration, 1/3 of the men that enlisted in the Army deserted.
Yeah.
So, you know, you enlist in the Army, right? How long did you enlist for? 5 years. That's a long time to commit to anything. How much you get paid? $13 a month. Then all this business, you know, about the Army gold and the guys stealing the Army gold, they never paid in gold, paid in greenbacks. And somebody figured out it'd be cheaper to send a paymaster around every 2 months instead of once a month. So 6 times a year you got paid. In 1878, 1877, and all of their wisdom and public service, the Congress forgot to pass a pay appropriation for the United States Army, so these guys went for a whole year without money. And there's always somebody ready to loan you money at 30 or 40%. So yeah. So that's why one of the first things they did in the late 1880s when they had the Army Reform Acts, you know what the first thing was? Cut enlistments to 3 years. And the second thing was, get paid every month. Of course, by that time, many of the Army posts were located on the railroads, and so you were able to get your paymaster around a little easier than you could in the 60s and the 70s. Anything else? John.
Was it really an F troop?
You know, there was, yes, there was an F troop. The one they didn't have was, you know, the troops, there were 12 troops to a regiment of cavalry. And they went A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, K, L, M. They didn't have a J. Never. They had an F, but no
In
J.
western Nebraska, wasn't there a Fort John?
That was a fur trading post.
Oh,
That was
okay.
south of
That's all.
Gering. Yeah, yeah.
And then, some of those maps, it said Fort Rice, then it would say DT,
Dakota Territory.
okay, and then CT was Colorado?
Colorado,
Okay.
Mhm.
And then this Gratton, Ash Hollow? is that
Gratton
by
is right.
Oshkosh, or?
It's right, you know, when you come out of the hollow and right before you cross the Platte River, there's a road that turns to the east.
By what city though? By what?
Oh, it's by Llewellyn.
Oh, yeah, well, okay.
But the fort was actually just down that road, just maybe 100 yards. It's pretty well gone. You can't even tell where it was.
And then, Phil Kearney and Kearney are two different
Two different guys.
forts? Two
different
guys?
forts, two different
One
guys.
was in Nebraska City.
The one was in Kearney, Nebraska, and the
which
other
one
was,
was Phil Kearney?
and that was up the one up on the Bozeman Trail.
Oh,
up there.
there's three of them.
There's two of them. Well, they moved
Oh.
the first Fort Kearney to the second location, yeah.
Okay.
But Stephen Watts Kearney and Philip Kearney, two different Army officers entirely. So, thank you very much for coming out, and we'll see you next month.